Well, I associate myself with Senator Chichester's remarks and also with what he said about Virginia Free. You're the outstanding business organization in the state. The one thing, Jimmy, you left out of my introduction is that the thing I'm proudest of is I retired from Congress undefeated and unindicted. So I'm very, very proud. You know, we have had divided government for 3/4 of the time since 1980, so that's not new to us, divided government. Divided government's accomplished a number of things. I always said in 1994, my constituents in Fairfax elected me to protect them from Bill Clinton, and 2 years later they re-elected Clinton to protect them from me. I mean, to some extent there's a balancing to this, but sometimes we're able to accomplish a lot of things. But since 1994, you just fast forward to today, there have been a number of what I call macro trends we need to recognize that get in the way of bipartisanship and sometimes members being able to exercise their independent judgment. I start with the fact that today, more than ever, for most times since the Civil War, the parties are what we say are ideologically sorted. National Journal's vote rating showed in the Senate now for the second straight Congress, the most liberal Republican in the Senate is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat in the Senate. And by the way, the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, Ben Nelson's retiring. It only gets worse. In the House, there are 2 Democrats that are more conservative than a handful of Republicans. Mike Ross from Arkansas and Boren from Oklahoma, they're both retiring. And when you take the top 15 Democrats in terms of moderation, 3 others got defeated in primaries this year. Why is that? Well, let me just give you 3 major reasons, what I call macro trends, that have led to this ideologically sorting and the inability of the parties to get together. Let's start with redistricting. Today, lines are drawn in a creative way, and by the way, with the assistance unintended of the Voting Rights Act, where we're packing Democratic voters into districts, so that most districts are pre-designed to elect one party or the other. In 2010, we had the largest midterm turnover since 1938. And yet, as you went into September, less than a quarter of the seats were truly contested. These seats were already designed by the makeup, by the way they had been drawn to elect one party or the other. Charlie Cook, who rates these things on an annual basis, says under the new districts, less than 20% of the House seats will be genuinely contested between the parties over the next decade. What does that mean? That means 4/5 of the members are sitting there not worried about the general election or independent voters, they're worried about winning their primaries. And primary voters don't reward compromise. They punish compromise. Ask Dick Lugar, I could give you a whole series, like Mike Castle in Delaware, Bob Bennett in Utah. But that has added to this polarization where members now look at their primary races as their race to get back into Congress, into the House and Senate. Now, redistricting is on the House side. On the Senate side, you have some residential sorting. You have hard red states, and there are very few blue members from red states, and you have very few red members from blue states anymore. We've become almost a parliamentary system now in our votes for Congress. Senator Moore being a notable exception to that. Secondly, let's look at the media models. The media model of Fox and MSNBC. Have you ever watched them on the same night? We need a translator. And then add to that, their media model thrives on polarization. It thrives on chaos. It thrives on parties going against each other and shout-outs. Add to that talk radio and finally the internet, of which there are no filters. The internet now is how a lot of people, 40% of people get their news from the internet. You don't have filters like Walter Cronkite had when he read the news. There's no fact check. In fact, what I call the crap to content ratio coming over the internet is just very high. So no wonder why a lot of Americans thought Barack Obama was born in Kenya because they saw his birth certificate on the internet. In fact, I started to believe it myself till I saw his birth certificate from Indonesia come over on the same thing. But you're dealing in a world now where politicians don't even deal with the same set of facts. And finally, add to what Senator Chichester talked about, and that is campaign finance. Between McCain-Feingold, the Campaign Finance Reform Bill, which I voted against, I'm proud to say, and the Citizens United court case, what has happened? Well, campaign finance did one thing. It restricted the way political parties could raise money. In a sense, it sounded good. We're going to get special interest money away from the parties and the politicians they influence. But the myth was somehow this money would go away. This money didn't disappear. It went away from the parties, which had been a centering force in American politics for 200 years because they have to compete for the middle to win. It went out to the wings. And what you find now is that in a special election in Arizona tomorrow, in a lot of these key races, you'll find more money spent by interest groups than the parties and candidates combined. And these interest groups are ideological in their nature, for the most part, and they pull candidates off. Candidates, I've talked to so many members that say, geez, I don't want these groups coming after me. So there's a disciplining factor on their voting for that. So when we talk about the polarization, we can talk about individuals and leadership, but the macro factors have had a huge effect in terms of the way that politicians act to them. Finally, I want to just end up with a quick story. We have, as you know, Washington is a very polarized town right now. It's not just the Republicans and Democrats, it's the House and Senate, it's the executive branch and legislative branch. I think for most of us that have been around this town for a long time, we know there's only one thing that brings this town together, however briefly each year, and that, of course, is the Washington Redskins. Usually a pretty brief period of time, too. It lasts about 3-4 weeks. But I was out at the opening game last year, and I was sitting way up in the cheap seats, but I noticed an empty seat on the 50-yard line. And it was empty at the end of the first quarter, it was empty at the end of the second quarter. So at halftime, I walked down about 6 tiers to where the seat was. It was still empty, it was next to an elderly lady. I tapped her on the shoulder, I said, ma'am, is this seat taken? She said, well, as a matter of fact, it's not. I said, would you mind if I sat here for the second half? She said, please be my guest, I could use the company. I said, I can't believe there's an empty seat here on the 50-yard line. These seats are scalping for hundreds of dollars out front. I said, well, what happened here? She said, well, that's my husband's ticket. And to underscore her loyalty, she said, my husband and I have been to 30 straight Redskin openers, she said, but he died. She said, but I know he would have wanted me to be here today. And I said, ma'am, I am so sorry. I said, but couldn't you have found a friend or a relative that could have used the other ticket? And she said, no. She said, they're all at the funeral. So we need the same kind of loyalty to product we have for the Redskins. Thank you.